everybody, welcome to Chapter 5. In Chapter 5 we are going to focus on somatoform and dissociative disorders. Somatic symptom disorders are characterized by extreme and long-lasting focus on multiple physical symptoms for which there is no medical cause or event. So when you think of somatoform disorders, that root word, that soma, means body. So that should give you like a little mental shortcut. Dissociative disorders, on the other hand, are characterized by feelings of detachment from one's own existence, from yourself, from your body, from your surroundings, from your reality, causing their identity to disintegrate and break down. So dissociation and dissociative experiences are alterations or detachment in consciousness, reality, or surroundings. We've all experienced this, and on a small level, it's not a problem. It's totally normal. So for example, if you've ever had a feeling like something on your body doesn't belong to you, like your hand is sitting on a table and you feel like it's, yes, I know this is my hand, I know it's attached to me, but it doesn't feel like it is, it feels like it's a foreign object, or something like that, that's a dissociative experience. And that's not clinically noteworthy in and of itself. It has to be more intensified, and we'll talk about that. But let's start with somatic disorders first. The first is called somatic symptom disorder, and this is a disorder with extreme, long-lasting symptoms for which no cause is medically apparent. So there's something extremely wrong with your bodily function, but there's absolutely no medical origin for why it's occurring. Doctors can't find it. Symptoms can change over time. So it can start out as, let's say, blindness for an extended period of time with no medical explanation, and eventually the blindness will go away and paralysis will set in with no medical explanation. Again, with still no identifiable cause or diagnosis. People who suffer from this often feel weak and ill. Like I said, they can suffer from paralysis, for which there's no identifiable cause, and literally the body part will stop working. They can also suffer from severe pain, which is completely psychosomatic. It's completely driven by a mental issue. It has nothing to do with a physical problem, but it doesn't lessen the fact that they experience pain nonetheless. Anxiety and distress compound the severity of these symptoms, and once again, there's no medical explanation or cause for them. So that's somatic symptom disorder. The next disorder you are probably familiar with is called illness anxiety disorder. Again, this is a term that has been revised. You've probably heard of this before as hypochondriasis, or you've heard of hypochondriacs. In the previous DSM, in the DSM-4, that it was listed as hypochondriasis. We've changed the name due to stigmatization. And now it's illness anxiety disorder. This is where the individual experiences extreme anxiety over the belief that he or she is suffering from an illness or disease, or is going to suffer from an illness or disease. Again, with no physical cause or basis. Okay, so they're not suffering from symptoms, they weren't exposed to an illness, but they worry on it. They mentally perseverate on the illness and the symptoms that haven't yet happened, right? Or the concern that they're going to happen. If they have symptoms, the symptoms are incredibly mild. Often they don't have symptoms at all. And the symptoms, if they have them when they're mild, are too mild to constitute an actual illness. The individual becomes preoccupied with being sick rather than actually suffering from the illness. So they're not actually suffering from any physical problem, or if they are suffering, it's incredibly mild. It's not an actual symptom that raises itself to the point of medical diagnosis. But they are constantly worried and experience extreme anxiety at the concept of becoming ill or becoming sick, and it becomes inhibiting to their life. The worry is what inhibits them. So causal explanations for these two disorders. These are both somatic symptom and illness anxiety disorder are disorders of cognition or perception, meaning it has no physical root in the pain or the sickness. It's all going on up here. What the physical manifestations are demonstrative of the anxiety and the worry. Often there's a strong underlying meaning, which means they often grew up watching a parent or somebody significant in their lives engage in symptoms of these disorders, and as a child began to adopt the same worries and behaviors, and it became a regular problem as an adult. Treatment for this, again, we go back to cognitive behavioral therapy. It's the old go-to, change the thoughts so we can change the behaviors. Another method of treatment for somatoform disorders is education. Educating people about the illness, their mental illness, so they can distinguish between what they're experiencing and educating them about actual physical, tangible illnesses that would cause those symptoms allows them to distinguish. I don't really have the illness. I'm not really ill. There's nothing physically wrong with me. This is a cognitive process. This is a perception problem. It's not a physical problem. And being able to have that knowledge allows them to distinguish and have a better grip on what the situation is. There's also exposure therapy. So the way we do exposure therapy for people with somatoform disorders is usually through exposing them to documentaries that provide real-life illness, people who suffer from the illnesses, showing their symptomology, showing their actual suffering, showing treatments and so forth. And we slowly expose them to these documentaries and this information in order to demystify or desensitize them from the worry that they experience about getting sick, being sick, having paralysis, etc. There's also something called psychological factors affecting a medical condition. This is a little bit different. It's a little marriage of both, where there is an actual physical problem. There's an actual medical diagnosable condition that impacts your body. However, there are psychological factors that can impact the course of the actual medical diagnosis. So I think it's easiest to understand this in terms of an example. So, for example, if somebody's diagnosed with diabetes, and they're in denial that they have the diabetes, right? So the denial would be the psychological factor. I'm denying that I'm sick. I'm denying that I've had a diagnosis, right? That denial will subsequently result in behaviors that impact the illness. So if you're in denial, you're not going to be checking blood sugars. You're not going to alter diet. You're not going to administer insulin, which is going to physically impact the way your body functions in a negative capacity. So it's not that there's an absence of a medical diagnosis or a physical problem. It's absolutely there, but it's the psychological factors that are keeping the individual from proper treatment. And it worsens their overall state because of those psychological factors. The next somatoform disorder is called conversion disorders. Conversion disorders are the physical malfunctioning, such as paralysis or blindness, which suggests some neurological impairment or dysfunction. However, there's no identifiable or organic explanation as to the cause. So you have some sort of problem that would indicate there must be some sort of malfunctioning happening somewhere in the brain. But when clinicians and doctors, informal medical doctors go and they do MRIs and they do CTEs and so forth, not CTEs, sorry, I'm in the CTE. They do CAT scans and so forth, they see that there's no dysfunction or there's no abnormality of the brain whatsoever. The symptomology suggests that there's neurological impairment, but there's absolutely no tangible reason for that symptomology, right? Interestingly enough, when conversion disorders happen, they experience the symptom, even though it's not being caused, but the symptom can go away. So for example, somebody who's experiencing blindness, that's a conversion disorder, right? There's no organic or biological reason that they should be experiencing the blindness. It has something to do with, mental illness and emotional disorder. But if you are with them and somebody shouts in a building, you're in a building and somebody shouts, the building's on fire, we all have to get out. In a moment of adrenaline, in a moment of fear, in a moment of panic, the blindness can disappear and they'll get up and just run right out the door and run right out of the building, right? Which again goes to demonstrate the fact that this is a mental illness, it is not a physical problem, right? So in the face of emergency, their body will often override the psychological dysfunction. Malingering. Malingering is an issue, it's an illness, or it's a behavior. Okay? Malingering means that you're purposely faking symptoms of a psychological or a physical disorder. So you could be faking mental illness or physical illness in this instance. And the idea here is that you're doing it for gain of some kind, whether it's gaining a financial settlement, whether it's getting out of work and still receiving workers' compensation, so that you can still receive a paycheck without actually having to work, etc. That's what malingering is. Malingering is often very purposeful, but it can also become very compulsively behavioral, that there are entire people who sort of make a career out of malingering, that they are constantly presenting with symptomology of mental illness or physical illness that would keep them from work, but that would entitle them to money. Okay, this is followed by factitious disorder, which is a psychological or a medical disorder that is purposefully faked, but for no apparent reason beyond attention or sympathy. That's the distinction between malingering and factitious disorder. Malingering has a typically there's some sort of financial motivation to the behavior. Whereas factitious disorder, the individual is not interested in money, the individual is not interested in getting out of work, but what they are interested in is the attention that comes with being sick, right? That I'm suffering, I'm ill, and they get a lot of value out of people feeling sympathy, empathy, people helping them, people telling them that they're fighting the good fight, it's brave how they're struggling and so forth. That's why they fake the disorder. There's also something called factitious disorder imposed on another. You're probably more familiar with this as being termed Munchausen by proxy, which is what we used to call it in the DSM-IV, and what it's recognized as in popular culture. And what this is when a caretaker, typically a parent to a child, will induce harm or illness in their child for the purpose of attention or sympathy as the caretaker. So this is where a caretaker or a parent, and it is typically a mother, this is found more notably among women caretakers than men, will induce illness and harm in their child, right? And the way we identify this is that the child repeatedly goes to the hospital with very serious symptomology, but doctors can't figure out any cause for what's going on. When they review the medical records of the child over, let's say, the past 12 or 24 months, they'll see there's been multiple trips. Each one has been really, really serious, and each one shows different symptoms, and none of those symptoms point to any problem. And that's when doctors start to say, I wonder if we have an instance of factitious disorder imposed on another. Because there's no medical explanation, and it's very statistically anomalous for a child to be constantly taken to the hospital with this wide array of symptoms. People who engage in factitious disorder imposed by another will often use chemicals, add chemicals to their children's food to induce illness. They may inject chemicals or foreign substances into their children. They may expose them to physical harm, so that there's a reason to go to the doctor. There's a reason to panic. There's a reason to notify everybody, oh my gosh, my child is sick, my child is hurt, we're in the hospital again. And the gain that they get from that is that the people around them in their community are very supportive and sympathetic and empathetic and saying, my gosh, I don't know how you're surviving this. What you're going through is terrible. What can I do? That's the gain for the individual who engages in factitious disorder imposed on another. The causes of conversion disorders, according to Freud, are often that the individual experienced trauma at some point in their younger life. The trauma will result in anxiety, right? The person pushes the unpleasant feelings and memories away so that they don't have to experience the anxiety. This is not a healthy method of coping. And ultimately what Freud argued is that when we push those bad memories and feelings down and we don't deal with them, they will manifest themselves in other ways in our bodies, such as hysterical blindness or paralysis that we can't explain or constant worry about illness. That the issue is if you focus on the trauma and you work through the trauma, the conversion disorders will go away. Something that is specific to conversion disorders, which is the malingering, the factitious disorder imposed on another, are primary and secondary gains. So let me define each one. First is a primary gain, and this is the reduction of anxiety, which reinforces that which is causing the conversion symptom. So for example, when somebody is experiencing anxiety about that negative trauma, right, what happens is the conversion symptom will flare up, right? And what's really happening is the person is experiencing anxiety but pushing it away. You can't get rid of it completely. It manifests itself somewhere else. So that's a primary gain. The secondary gain for conversion disorders is when people receive attention and sympathy for their suffering. This results in positive reinforcement because it's what they're looking for often, and it increases the behavior. Those secondary gains increase the behavior. That sympathy, that attention, that support only causes people to malinger more or turn up their factitious disorder. The treatment for conversion disorders is to identify the original trauma or stressor and deal with it head on in a healthy capacity, and also to find ways to reduce primary and secondary gains. So for example, a big one would be if people are aware that this person has factitious disorder, we don't show sympathy, we don't show empathy, because all that's doing is reinforcing the abnormal and behavior in the mental illness. So we reduce those gains. I want to talk about depersonalization. Depersonalization is a temporary loss of reality. It's often described as if you are on the outside of yourself, watching yourself in a dreamlike state. People, like I said, this is something that's sort of on a spectrum. We can all experience depersonalization, and it's not necessarily a concern unless it gets, too far on the other end of that spectrum. There's also derealization, which is a sense of reality that the external world is lost. Both depersonalization and derealization are experiences where one is disassociating from reality. So this gets us into our dissociative disorders. Disassociating from reality means that there is some kind of break. I used to have this a lot as a child, the derealization, where I would wake up in the morning, always happened in the morning, I would wake up in the morning and I could hear my parents talking, but it sounded like they were on fast forward. I don't know how else to explain it. Like I was, sort of removed from reality in a capacity while I would lay in bed and I could just hear them talking, but it sounded like they were going a mile a minute in fast forward. That would be an example of derealization and dissociating. However, dissociative issues can be far more severe. So one of the dissociative issues that we talk about is amnesia, and there's different types of amnesia. The first is dissociative amnesia, which is an inability to recall your personal information. This typically happens as a result of extreme stress or trauma, okay, head damage in particular. But there are several types of dissociative amnesia, and they are as follows. The first is generalized amnesia. This is a loss of memory of all personal information and identity. This can be short-term or it can last for a lifetime. There are people who never ever get their memory back. So that's generalized amnesia. There's selective or localized amnesia, which is memory loss that is specific to one time or event. This means that you don't forget who you are, you don't forget what you like, what you don't like, what you do for a living, who your family is. You don't forget any of that. You know who you are and you have memories. However, you are lacking a memory on one specific traumatic event. You can't remember anything about it before, during, or after. It's just gone from your memory. That's selective or localized amnesia. There's also dissociative fugue, which is called a fugue state. This is an inability to recall one's past, and this is often accompanied by some sort of geographical flight from home. Sometimes individuals in fugue states may go on to develop a new identity. They may never recall their identity. They may start a whole new life and a whole new family. There are cases that have been documented where that's happened and their old family ends up finding them, and it's a heck of a story. This illness is typically characterized by a desire or a need to mentally flee your life. There's something so emotionally stressful and intense going on that the mind can just no longer take it. It shuts down and the person flees. The best example of this is in Breaking Bad, where Walter White fakes a fugue state to cover for his bad behavior. He fakes a fugue state that he's been suffering from cancer, and one day he just lost his memory of who he was, where he was, and they found him wandering in a grocery store. Now granted, he was faking that, but that is what he was presenting was an example of a fugue state. Okay, so treatment. Fugue states tend to resolve themselves on their own after a period of time. Typically, memories return. Like I said, there are cases where they don't. Those are extremely rare, and they're just really rare, but sometimes it never comes back, and these people go on to just build a whole new identity in life. The same is true of dissociative amnesia. Therapy focuses on strengthening coping mechanisms because the point behind the amnesia and the fugue state is often you are so overwhelmed from whatever it is that's taking place that your mind just shuts down. It just shuts down as a form of protection. You can't remember what's going on. You can't remember who you are. And it's if we can shore up your coping mechanisms in the face of stress, we can avoid the recurrence of amnesia or fugue states. Finally, we're going to get into dissociative identity disorder, which is very controversial. You probably know this as multiple personality disorder, which is the name that it was used or labeled under in the DSM-4, and for many, many years. It is a huge part of our pop culture. Many people are aware of this because of the original movies. Sybil and the Three Faces of Eve is when it really entered our public consciousness. And this is where an individual can have up to 100 distinct different personalities. All of them can have different mannerisms, all of them can have different characteristics, they can have different personalities, they can share characteristics to one another, but there is always one main personality, the main person, and we call that person the host, right? They are the host, they are the original personality, right? It's the host identity. Often, this is characterized, again, by severe trauma. Frequently characterized, people who suffer from this frequently have strong histories of childhood physical and sexual abuse that are not just bad. All childhood abuse and sexual abuse is bad, but excessively severe, excessively violent. And the idea being that the individual's one personality, psyche, cannot manage all of the trauma and the damage from that experience. So it splinters into multiple personalities, and each personality is sort of responsible for handling a different issue. So there's often like a little girl personality, or there's a tough personality that handles the confrontation, or there's, you know, the kind mothering personality. These are just sort of examples that they all sort of take on a different emotional role in the personality, because the host identity, the idea here is the host identity cannot handle all of that stress. So the host identity splinters into multiple personalities that can break up the stress and manage it. When somebody goes from one personality to another, we call this a switch. It happens instantaneously without warning. The new personality, like I said, it can have a different tone of speaking, it can have an accent, it can have different mannerisms, personality characteristics. The host may not be a smoker, but a personality may be a smoker. All of these things have been seen in examples of DID. Now this is where it gets really controversial. Is this real or is it faked? I will be, full disclosure, I don't think it's real, right? I don't think it's real. There's just not enough in the literature to tangibly document that this happens. Dissociative identity disorder, first and foremost, is incredibly rare, right? But among the cases that we have very little that we can tangibly measure to say, yes, this exists, or no, it's definitely faked. There's just a lot of gray area, right, relative to other illnesses. There's a large amount of debate as to whether this condition is real, or if people are faking, right? That people, or perhaps they're not even faking, perhaps they're just presenting different personalities as a coping mechanism to stress. Doesn't mean that there's not a problem. It doesn't mean that the person doesn't need care. Doesn't mean that the person's not suffering. Clearly they are if they're partaking in this behavior. But does it mean that it's completely out of their control, that it just manifests, that it just happens, that we can all have, you know, hundreds of personalities if we're put under enough stress? I personally do not subscribe to that. A great deal of clinicians do not subscribe to that concept. It's become a pop culture phenomenon. There's been a lot of movies and television shows that it makes for a great story, right? There are many people throughout criminal history who have used this as a defense for explaining their crimes, that it wasn't me who did it, it was one of my other personalities. Largely, all of them, if that I'm aware of, have been debunked, right? They were caught malingering, right? They're faking to avoid a conviction, and they were, you know, caught with their symptomology not being consistent. This is notably more common in women than in men. Without treatment, it will persist through the life course. Like I said, there's always a presence of severe childhood abuse. There is another theory. I would be much more likely to subscribe to this personally, that dissociative identity disorder is actually a chapter, if you will, of post-traumatic stress disorder. The concept there being that the theory being that it's not a whole separate disorder unto itself. This is something that manifests itself sometimes in people with PTSD who have experienced something that's so horrendous that this is just how they manage the stress. This is how they manage it, is coming up with different, you know, sort of organized personalities to manage what the main person doesn't want to deal with. Also, almost sort of like, I can't deal with this as an individual, so I'm going to outsource this to my other personality, and therefore, if this other personality is managing it, I don't have to manage it, right? Still a problem, right? I could see this being much more a realistic explanation that somebody with PTSD, which we have, is very documented, very solidly documented in the research, and that this is a symptom of it rather than its own specific disorder. Treatment for this. The idea is to reintegrate all personalities back into the host. That each personality is a little part of the host, and we need to get them to all meld into one person and become personality characteristics rather than individual personalities that manifest themselves with different mannerisms and speaking and so forth. Another option is to identify that which triggers DID and other personalities to come out. So if we know certain things trigger a switch, we avoid those things, right? So we avoid stressful situations that trigger a switch so that the host personality can maintain. or we neutralize those triggers in some capacity. Another option is hypnosis. Hypnosis can be used to recover memories of the trauma in order to deal with them head on. If the trauma can be recalled and dealt with, there may no longer be a need for that individual to splinter the personalities. However, DID overall as a disorder is not very successfully or well treated. There is treatment. It can cause a minimization of the switching. And in the absence of any treatment, we see an increase in the switching and the dysfunction. But there's no successful overall consistent treatment for this problem or for this issue.